This is Questions of Courage, a podcast from the youth section at the Goetheanum, hosted by Nathaniel Williams.
Welcome to Questions of Courage. As I've mentioned many times, the title for these productions comes from an address that Rudolf Steiner gave over 100 years ago to a circle of young people. And in it he said, one of the most important qualities that we need today in order to think in a deeper manner about ourselves and about the world is courage. It's courage that's needed to be able to seriously and sincerely think about things that are not habitually how things are considered or maybe conventional opinion. And today I'd like to introduce an example from an individual who demonstrated this remarkable courage and creativity. He was a contemporary of Rudolf Steiner's. His name's Henri Bergson. And in the beginning, I just share a puzzle. Now, this puzzle is old. Now, it's a kind of variation on a puzzle that comes from an ancient philosopher named Zeno. Zeno's famous paradoxes. It's not exactly how he put it, but it is in the same spirit. And if you take, for instance, a turtle, an animal that is famous for, well, being slow. And you take, at that time, let's say, one of the most famous athletes, who was Achilles, and you set them up to race. Now, if you ask Achilles to follow the rule that he can only advance halfway towards the goal of the race, towards the finish line, and he can always only proceed by going halfway the distance that remains, and once again measuring halfway to the goal, traveling that distance, he always has to break the distance he has to travel in half and make that step and then break it again. If he agrees to that rule, without a doubt, the tortoise will win the race. I remember when I heard this when I was younger, I thought it was absurd. Of course, Achilles is going to win the race. If Achilles runs, but after puzzling over it, which is of course what makes it so interesting, you realize that the distances between 2 points can be divided infinitely. You can always divide a distance. And so, in essence, Achilles would never reach the goal. Not only would he lose to the tortoise, but he would never reach the end of the race. And this kind of puzzle, this kind of tension and almost anxiety-inducing riddle is something that was a kind of creative experience for Henri Bergson. And Bergson had the feeling that in it, he was finding two different ways of experiencing reality, two different ways of thinking. One through the intellect, which can divide things into discrete objects, separate objects. But the other, the lived experience of every moment qualitatively that we have as conscious beings. And these things have an interesting relationship together. So for Bergson, this riddle that if you try to approach life through the measuring intellect, you can never get into movement. But on the other hand, through a kind of aesthetic intuition and experience of just being conscious of the whole of our lives in any given moment, we're participating in a different kind of judgment, a different kind of intelligence, which he called intuition, and that he related to aesthetic intuition, so also the experience of art and creativity, and in the end, for him, also freedom. And in one of his late books, An Introduction to Metaphysics, The Creative Mind, he gives a really plain, everyday description of this, which I find extremely approachable, and I'd like to share here. He talks about how when he thinks about going to a party, he's going to a gathering, going to see some friends, He makes pictures in his head of what is going to happen there, what it's about, etc. And what astounds him every time is that when he gets there, how rich, how full of life, how unanticipatable the event is in comparison to the intellectual picture that he could make of it. So, for instance, he writes, I know what people I shall find at this gathering, around what table and what order to discuss what problem, but let them come, be seated, and chat as I expected. Let them say what I was sure they would say. The whole gives me an impression at once novel and unique, as if it were but now designed in one original stroke by the hand of an artist. Gone is the image I had conceived of it, a mere pre-arrangeable juxtaposition of things already known. I agree that the picture has not the artistic value of a Rembrandt or a Delacroix, yet it is just as unexpected, and in this sense, quite as original. What does this become for Bergson? This is where so interesting and inspiring, this kind of riddle, which from a young man he experienced. He felt that being present and being open to perceiving the wholeness of the present moment, he was closer to life. And that his intellect had the tendency, while it was extremely clear and gave him certain confidence, that it led away from life and that it couldn't actually enter into the source of experience. And this led him to write one of the most remarkable books on evolution that appeared in the last century. It's called Creative Evolution. And what he came to was that through our participating in the living moment of perception, through intuition, and through practicing being present in a more pictorial, narrative, qualitative, artistic way, that we actually connect with the source of life and the source of life that has led through evolution, through the evolution of all the plants and all the animals. Now, this may seem a very big jump, understandably, but it is brilliant work that I highly encourage anyone to read who's looking for a kind of representative of courageous thinking. And I'm going to share two quotes in conclusion from Bergson from Creative Evolution and say a couple words about them. And I hope that it lights a fire for those who are interested in evolution, but also evolution that tries to bring together the experience of the spirit with natural history and with biological evolution. So, in speaking about these intuitions that we have of the wholeness of life as a wholeness, he writes, "These fleeting intuitions, which light up their object only at distant intervals, philosophy ought to seize, first to sustain them, then to expand them, and so unite them together. The more it advances in this work, the more will it perceive that intuition is mind itself, and in a certain sense, life itself. The intellect has been cut out of it by a process resembling that which has generated matter. Thus is revealed the unity of the spiritual life. We recognize it only when we place ourselves in intuition, in order to go from intuition to the intellect. For from the intellect we shall never pass to intuition." And in this passage, in a certain way, he describes what he tries to do with his work, which is to recognize these moments of being in a qualitative intuition in the present moment and trying to stay with it, trying to unite with it, trying to be able to sustain them and prolong them, and to try to be able to make them a source of new knowledge, which he calls metaphysics, or the proper role of philosophy. But he obviously goes further here, and he says, when we see that intellect can only take ideas, observations, or parts of our lived experience and create systems with them, this he compares to matter in relationship to life. And this is indeed the bold and intriguing result that he arrives at, fostering this riddle that he had as a young man, that there is an affinity between the intellect and between matter and determinism. And that if you follow this through, what you find in the history of biological evolution is an attempt for life to create a vehicle for itself that was not determined by matter. And that the pinnacle of this achievement is the human being. Now, that may seem difficult to follow given what I've said, but maybe intriguing enough to get you to look more into Bergson. I'd like to close with exactly a reflection on evolution from Creative Evolution, Bergson's book. And he says, when you look at the progression of elementary living organisms, you see an attempt for life to be active in matter in such a way that it can still maintain its free creative unity. But what happens is that, in a sense, it's unsuccessful. And so he writes, the gates of its prison close as soon as they are opened. By pulling at its chain, it succeeds only in stretching it. With man, consciousness breaks the chain. In man, and in man alone, it sets itself free. The whole history of life until man has been that of the effort of consciousness to raise matter, and of the more or less complete overwhelming of consciousness by the matter which has fallen back on it. And so in a certain sense, he sees in the wonderful array of life the presence of the creative energy which we experience through self-consciousness as human beings, having entered into matter, but in its creative result, in a sense, having been overcome by the quality or the character of matter. And so leading to determinate forms of life, unfree forms of life. And so we see how he connects creativity with freedom. And when the human being, the human body, is created, finally, a vehicle is achieved that can accommodate self-consciousness of this living source of creativity itself. And so he brings together the human experience, the experience of aesthetic intuition, with the cosmic source of creation of life, and with the connection of life and matter. And if anything, one has to be astounded by the creative brilliance of Bergson when reading him, and even if one comes to different conclusions. And we also have to recognize in him a definite element of courage that he demonstrated through first committing to pursue these thoughts, but then to publicly speak with such plain language about them and share them. Questions of Courage is a simple production, collaboration between the youth section and the communications team at the Goetheanum. I highly encourage anyone who appreciates this to consider supporting the youth section and youth work. The Goetheanum itself, of course, has only been possible through the enthusiastic volunteerism, generosity of people from all over the world the last 100 years. And we are definitely dependent on that in continuing our work. Thank you.